Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out new episodes of the show every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. If you missed an episode or want to get more information about the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Paul Pryce. He's the diplomatic aide at the Japanese Consulate in Calgary. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you for having me on here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. You have a really impressive background kind of in school and career-wise, and I'm really interested to learn more. But maybe before we kind of get into that, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Sure. So my family immigrated to Canada from the UK when I was quite young, and we moved around a lot of Western Canada, never really living anywhere longer than about a year. So I became quite familiar with the region, and I think maybe getting to meet people from a lot of different walks of life left me predisposed towards diplomacy and just trying to understand where people are coming from and finding that common ground between different parties, different stakeholders. And so I suppose that's why, as a part of a natural evolution, I find myself working for the Japanese in Western Canada.
Sure. No, I think that's fascinating. I always find other kind of cultures just fascinating, right? Whether you agree with it or not, it doesn't really matter. It's just interesting to learn about different things. And to be fair, I think like I always look back at the kind of like food analogy. Like I think some of the best cuisine are from other countries, at least in my opinion, and I enjoy them all the time, right?
For sure, yes. And I think that's one of the job-related perks, the opportunity to partake of sushi and sake.
Sure.
More so the former than the latter.
That's great, man. So let's kind of walk me through your kind of university education and what made you go and take those things in university.
Well, it's kind of interesting where my first kind of inclination towards what I would pursue as an education was dictated just by the people around me. I didn't really know what to do with myself. I was living in Brooks, a small town in southern Alberta, population 10,000, and I was doing quite well on social studies and legal studies. And so my teacher said, well, you should be a lawyer. And my parents kind of being the typical immigrant parents, it's you got to be a lawyer or a medical doctor. And so
Sure.
I thought, well, maybe I'll do pre-law at the University of Calgary. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, my principal saw in me some leadership capabilities. I was really shy and reserved, actually. So I don't really know what motivated him to recommend me for it, but the Global Young Leaders Conference, this conference that was being put together with some support from the United Nations, but also the U.S. Congress, and getting to meet different decision makers, policymakers in Washington, D.C. and New York City over the course of the summer. And so as soon as I came back to Canada from the U.S., I was like, no, I got to change my major. It's political science. I want to do diplomacy. I don't want to argue over parking tickets. I want to help reach ceasefire agreements on wars and, trade agreements and so on. Maybe it's not as romantic as I'd initially thought when I was switching majors, but I don't regret the decision to change from pre-law to political science.
No, totally. That's kind of fascinating that you kind of not like fell into it, but it just kind of happened organically and you got kind of passionate about that. And I always love when people kind of almost like fall into a career.
Yes, yeah. And I'm deeply appreciative of the principal and those teachers that had the faith in me to say, yeah, let's nominate this guy to go to this conference. Otherwise, I don't quite know where I would be, actually.
No, that's great, man. So you also went to university in Estonia, correct?
Yes, correct.
So what did you take there?
Yeah, that's a little bit of an unorthodox move, I'll admit. I was interested, actually, halfway through my bachelor's degree. My honors thesis topic was on African security politics, but
Okay.
I guess I suffer from a little bit of an academic ADHD where I'm interested in one topic, and then before I can finish a project on it, there's something else that comes up that really attracts me and leaves me feeling really interested. So 2007 was the cyber attacks against Estonia, kind of the first case of large-scale cyber warfare. And banks basically being shut down, government websites aren't functioning, just really the whole country's economy shut down in 2007 for a week or so. And I found that fascinating and wanted to know more. So before I'd finished my honors thesis, I knew what I wanted to write my master's thesis on. So I was looking at studying with the University of Alberta, but wanted to have some presence on the ground in Estonia, see actually what it's like there, speak with a lot of those who were involved in the decisions during that fateful week. So I negotiated a partnership between the University of Alberta and Tallinn University, and then went to Tallinn in Estonia for most of my degree program. And it was an interesting experience, and I got to learn a lot more about that country's cyber infrastructure, basically the birthplace of Skype, and the country that first held elections, legally binding elections online. So it was interesting to see what they're doing there, and some of the potential applications for that to the Canadian context, especially when it comes to e-health.
Sure. No, that's actually quite fascinating. So do you think they moved a lot of that stuff kind of online because of the attacks, or walk me through kind of like why they ended up kind of pushing almost like big products and big processes to the internet, right? With Skype and their, a bunch of e-government kind of stuff.
Certainly, yeah. I think they were already pushing a lot of that infrastructure online before the cyber attacks,
Okay.
But then they realized that the international attention that those attacks brought, those could be a downside. That could be something that frightens people about doing business in Estonia, or they could use it as a marketing opportunity. And so they really started to invest more in terms of cyber defense capabilities, and in some ways they've managed to set the gold standard for ensuring that online elections are the integrity is protected. It's tied a lot to a national ID card. I know that that's something that we probably would never see introduced in Canada or the US, the concern about privacy and so on, a card that keeps track of all your transactions and all your movements and so on. But in a small country of just 1.3 million people like Estonia, it was possible to implement this national ID card. So there is an offline component to that security for the online infrastructure. And I think that's something that's necessary, but maybe not really something we could replicate here in Canada or the US. So I guess I come away with a sober understanding of the opportunities here, that maybe we can't necessarily take everything, carbon copy everything that's been done in Estonia and implement it here.
Sure. I guess I know like people in probably North America would really fear like a government one of those, but in some ways, at least in my opinion, you could tell me your thoughts on this, like we almost give all that information to Google and Apple depending on which cell phone you use, right? At least in my opinion, they have a lot of that information.
Very true, yes, yeah. They already do have a lot of that information. I think one of the advantages to the private model, though, is the potential for data siloing, that it's a case of, well, okay, Google knows a certain amount of this picture, and Apple knows a certain amount of this picture, but so long as we don't have one body that has access to all those details, they might not necessarily have a complete picture of your private life. So I suppose that's one advantage to our model as opposed to the public one in Estonia, in which case there is one body that knows a lot of what you're up to.
Sure. No, that's a good point. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And some people switch over the years, and some people turn off that data and whatnot, and you can control it a bit more than if it's just you're constantly feeding this thing to one body. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious to know a little bit more of your kind of experience kind of in Estonia, and kind of your other kind of, job related stuff. You did some lectures, you've got kind of done a bunch of like research and analysis. Kind of walk me through some of that before we kind of get into your current role where you're a diplomatic aide.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So after I finished my degree at the University of Calgary, the undergraduate degree, it was 2008, and I think I did everything you shouldn't do in entering the workforce. Okay. And so my passion was, okay, I want to work for the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I call it NATO without the guns. It's just talking through the differences with Russia. And a lot of its focus has really been on initially, it was during the Cold War, making sure that there was an open line of communication to settle any misunderstandings that would form between the West and the Soviet bloc. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was more about addressing some of the ethnic conflicts that emerged in the former Yugoslavia, the Caucasus, parts of Central Asia, and now to some extent there's an interest in getting the OSCE involved in state-building efforts in Afghanistan.
Okay.
And so I was really interested in working with that organization, but didn't apply anywhere else, just to the OSCE, and just kind of waited over part of the summer. Come on, I want my dream job, and somehow I lucked out, and I got what should have been a boring research role in Vienna, but it turned out that my position coincided with the war in Georgia in 2008, where Russia was involved in some aggression against Georgian territories, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And so I was involved in a lot of the ceasefire talks and then the talks on delivering humanitarian aid to some of the communities that were affected by the fighting. So I kind of had a baptism by fire in that sort of role, and it was enjoyable. Wore me out a bit because there were very long days.
Sure,
of course, imagine. A very stressful working environment. But basically, the financial crisis caught up to me in 2009, and of course, there's a policy of called zero nominal growth in the budget, so no growth in the budget even to offset inflation. But of course, the duties and the pressures being placed on the OSCE were increasing. So of course, junior folks like me had to go. So I pursued my master's degree in the hopes of enhancing my qualifications, and in the process fell in love with Estonia and that spirit of entrepreneurialism there. So I stayed after my master's degree and was lecturing, as you mentioned, at Tallinn University of Technology, and also the Estonian Diplomatic Academy, talking about some of the experiences I had negotiating with the Russians during the war in Georgia.
Interesting. That's got to be like fascinating. Just having like a day and talking with that, and just kind of, I don't even know how to like explain that, right? Like that's, or even really understand that. Like it's just fascinating to me, right? Like just the types of stuff you guys are talking about and covering.
Yes, yeah, it really was a varied work environment because, of course, the war in Georgia was a big part of the duties there, but election observation was another thing too. So sometimes I was having to stay late in the office to do some phone calls actually to Jefferson City in Missouri to see if we could get access for election observers to some of the polling stations and so on. And so, Vienna is 8 hours ahead of Jefferson City, or I guess it was at that time due to daylight saving. So it was late evenings.
Sure, I can
people
imagine.
Don't pick up I found that people didn't pick up the phone before noon in Jefferson City. So
that's funny. So
yeah.
So I'm curious, what exactly is a diplomatic aide, and what do you do at the Japanese consulate?
So for the Japanese consulate, my interest is trying to make sure there's a business environment that's friendly to Japanese business and investment, and of course ensuring that any strategic commodities flow freely between Japan and Western Canada. So that involves a lot of research, sometimes a fair amount of advocacy, and of course networking with various levels of government. So we have a fairly large jurisdiction in Calgary. We cover Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories.
Oh, wow.
So I think we might actually have the biggest geographic jurisdiction of most Japanese diplomatic offices operating abroad. So it makes things very varied. One day you might be talking about canola exports from Manitoba, and the next thing you know, you're talking about gold mining in Nunavut.
Really? That's cool.
Yes, yeah.
So do you travel much?
Yes, there's a fair bit of travel within Western Canada, and that's one of the things I enjoy. It allows me to become reacquainted with my country of citizenship, that spending that time abroad in Austria, Montenegro, and Estonia, I really appreciate the chance to travel and see more of Canada. And to be honest, none of it's pretty hard to reach. It's, I think, from Calgary, maybe a $2,200 flight return trip, just because it's so remote and the connections are so infrequent. So I honestly probably couldn't afford to go visit it as a tourist, but doing it through business and being able to see what it's like there is a dream come true.
Sure. No, that's great. And do you get to go to Japan ever?
Uh, Basically, once a year, there's
Okay.
some briefings and some discussion of trade strategy and so on. What should we do given the U.S. change in position on TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership? So those make for some long and tense discussions sometimes.
Sure, because what are they, like a day ahead of us in, well, parts of North America at least?
Between Calgary and Tokyo, it's 16 hours. So I
16
guess,
hours. Okay.
say, Washington, D.C. to Tokyo, 14.
Yeah, okay. No, yeah, it's still quite a time difference, right? So
Yes, yeah.
so I'm curious, you've kind of traveled a bunch of the world and you kind of work with a lot of people that, aren't from North America. I'm really curious to know about what are some of the similarities and differences, with maybe culturally or business, similarities and differences that you've kind of experienced that a lot of people, I think, maybe in North America never would think of or is maybe not even on the radar of like, oh, wow, I didn't even realize that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think Canadians might be a bit too humble at times. I think we have a problem with dreaming big, and
Okay.
that's something that I'm sometimes jealous of when it comes to American entrepreneurs or even Chinese entrepreneurs, that there's no hesitancy to dream big or be willing to say, I am the best at this, or here are the steps I'm going to take to become the best at this.
Sure.
And that's the unfortunate thing where Canada, it's kind of a case of, well, yes, we have wheat and, the food quality is good and it's safe, it's nutritious, but we're not willing to say, Canada, birthplace of the world's best wheat or the best beef or so on and so forth. So I feel like we could use with being a bit more assertive somehow. And I don't quite know how we can build that national self-confidence yet. It's something that I certainly think about, but it's a challenge. I think that we're, in a way, holding ourselves back, and there's already these competitive disadvantages that we have from time to time. And on another level, maybe when it comes to that national imagination, Canadians don't seem to see ourselves as part of the Asia Pacific. It's interesting where the geographic distance between Vancouver and Tokyo is actually about the same as the geographic distance between Sydney and Tokyo. And
Oh,
so
really?
it's strange that we say Australia is an Asia Pacific country, but we don't say Canada is. We seem to restrict ourselves and say, no, we're just North American, instead of looking across the Atlantic and across the Pacific and seeing ourselves as part of something bigger.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see that. That's the other thing. I'm really curious to know your thoughts on this. Is do you find like I at least find this in a lot of Canadians, but I'm curious to know your take that we're basically people of like the world now, and so many
Hmm.
people just think about their geographical location. Where with the internet and even like what you're with your job, like you're basically doing business on a global scale every day. And I think a lot of people don't do that or think about doing that when they could easily do that for I don't know what the term or if there is a term for that or there's a better way to explain that, but I thought you're probably the best person to ask because you're basically doing business at a huge scale globally daily.
Yes, very, very true. And I feel like, though, as well, we don't necessarily have to do it at a huge scale to be global. There's a lot of food products that I'll see, for example, at farmers markets in small towns in Alberta or Saskatchewan, and these have an enormous export potential. There's a chance to sell these in China or in Vietnam if trade barriers are reduced. So it's interesting that we seem to think in phases that, okay, if I grow my small business from the local to eventually the provincial, then I can reach the regional and eventually national, and so on. I have to go step by step. But there's that potential actually to skip all those steps and actually go from the local to the global. we see this when it comes to maritime lobsters being sold overseas to China and Japan, where they're brought the same day on a plane. So it's interesting that when it comes to some commodities, we understand that potential to skip stages, but for the most part, when it comes to Canadian businesses, it's a very slow growth approach, and as I say, we're psychologically restricting ourselves.
Sure. So, is there any, and this is probably really dependent on the industry that you're in, but is there like a good resource or websites or things to do to say, like, maybe I have a small time business in, maybe a smaller town or even a bigger city, and I say, you know what, I think I could really sell my product in this country. Is there a good kind of resource for that, or is it just kind of like Google and figure it out, or?
Unfortunately, it's Google and figure it out.
I've kind of figured.
For Japan, there's the Japan External Trade Organization, JETRO, and that really is a one-stop resource for getting into the Japanese market. But I've been arguing a lot here in Alberta that we need to have a kind of single window, a website in which an entrepreneur can say, okay, I want to build a food processing facility to produce pork dumplings, and then I want to sell them to somewhere in the Asia Pacific region. And just going to that website and being able to access all the resources that are necessary to find someone who's with the Trade Commissioner Service, with Canada, Global Affairs Canada, and also find the right people within Alberta's Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry who can let them find the right sites for the facility, maybe even find a startup incubator and so on. So it's unfortunate that we're lacking those resources. It's too scattered. It's almost a shotgun strategy to economic diversification we're taking here. Just leave it to the entrepreneurs and eventually something will stick. But sometimes those entrepreneurs need a little extra help, a little extra hand up.
No, I think that's great. And like, I know there's kind of, and I don't really want to go like political with this, but I know there's been kind of a big push in kind of North America to be like made in North America by North Americans. But I think like we don't really talk about exporting our stuff, or at least I don't really see it in the media that much about actually exporting what we make here to other countries to bring money, from other countries into North America. And I don't see anything wrong with either solution, but I think to your point, like, if it's so challenging and we don't really have the resources to help each other kind of move our products out, that, it's not doing us any service, right?
It's true, yes, yeah. And unfortunately, there are certain populist movements in both Canada and US who want to talk about local product identities,
Sure.
saying, well, this is made in Alberta or made in Oregon, for example. And to be honest, a lot of the consumers in Japan or in Korea don't really know the difference between Alberta and Saskatchewan or where Alberta is. They know Canada. And so
Sure.
I think that national branding, made in Canada or made in America, works, but these sort of state or local identities, I don't really understand the push to promote those on a global level. I think people overestimate the quality of geography education in most countries.
Sure. I think that's actually a really good point. And I never thought of it like that, to be 100% honest with you. I think you're right. Like, if you're promoting, like if you're a brewery in Portland and you promote that it was made here in Portland, I think that's great. But you're right. If you're trying to get your beer into Japan, for example, you probably want to say made in America, not Portland, because they're going to be like, where's Portland? Or what is Portland?
Yes,
Potentially,
exactly, yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, the same way a Canadian consumer might be confused about a green tea made in Heilongjiang province, China, or Guangdong
Sure.
province. It's kind of a thing of, I don't know, I just like green tea. I don't care where it was made. Does it taste good, and is it inexpensive?
Sure, that's actually really interesting. So I'm curious to dive a little bit more. Like, is there anything else that we kind of don't really think about as kind of North Americans that, other cultures are really kind of are kind of a big deal?
I think sometimes we forget the power of relationships. I find within a lot of cultures, and it's not just necessarily the Asia Pacific region, the face-to-face contact is very important. And so I think that's where Canada, for example, is lagging behind Australia, is that in-market presence. So you'll have cabinet ministers from Australia or Prime Minister of Australia going into these markets, into China or into the Philippines, and meeting with people, signing agreements and so on. And this is seen as a sign or a show of confidence and a willingness to do business. And Canada, for whatever reason, we don't make those trips as often. It could be the public's concern with the expenses. You know, no one wants to subsidize a politician's travel plans or tourist stops in different countries. But to be honest, it's much more than tourism. It's a matter of actually getting out there and marketing and selling a product. And those public figures certainly play a role, and those relationships are very important.
Sure, and to your point earlier about being an entrepreneur trying to get your products into those countries, right? Like, it just feeds that, right? And makes it easier if there's a better relationships kind of at like a presidential or politician level.
Exactly, yes, yeah. If it's just some guy saying, buy my pork dumplings, it's kind of a thing of, well, I don't know if I should trust you. But if it's, well, your political leader accompanied you and said, these pork dumplings are amazing, you should really have them, then people kind of sit up and listen.
Yeah, no, that's actually really good advice. That's actually quite fascinating. So I'm curious, anything else that you could kind of recommend to people?
I think also understanding the different pace of business in different countries or in different cultures. I find, at least with the Japanese, there's a desire to stick with what you know. So it's a case of, okay, I've found a particular project or a particular sector which is proven to be profitable, and it's been reliable for my company for X number of years. So we want to stick with that and not really change too much, not really willing to diversify. And on the other side of things, business really happens at the speed of light in China. It's kind of a thing of, okay, I want this, you're selling this, here's how much I'm willing to offer, let's sign and let's get it done, let's move forward. I don't want to get to know you much more, let's just move ahead with this project. Of course, the thing is with Japan, that slow but steady growth is fairly dependable. It's not going to fall through. You don't need to worry too much about intellectual property rights there because the laws are more or less the same as they are here in Canada or the US. Whereas China, it's a little bit of a leap of faith in some ways. You don't know exactly if the other party is going to honor this. You know, intellectual property rights aren't quite well protected and so on. So it's just a matter of whether you're willing to take the gamble of operating in those faster markets like China, or if a person wants to go more with that slow, steady, but potentially stagnant growth like in Japan.
I got you. That's actually quite fascinating. So you kind of mentioned before we were recording that you're doing a bunch of stuff in the agriculture food processing space, and we've kind of covered it here and there. What exactly do you do in those spaces?
Sure. Well, I was recently elected the Director of Agriculture and Asia-Pacific Relations at the Alberta Council of Technology. So
congrats, man. That's great.
Thank you very much. So it's an interesting role, and I'm really enjoying developing the relationships with stakeholders and different people operating in the ag space, the agriculture and food processing space here in Alberta. And interestingly, I suppose since Alberta is so concerned with diversification, you know, we've depended so much on one product to base our economy on. It's just crude oil to the United States, one product to one market. And unfortunately, with oil prices being what they are now, that's not been necessarily good for economic growth in Alberta. So people are looking at diversifying into other industries. Maybe it's agriculture that we can flesh out more, and that could be the basis for future prosperity. And so the government of Alberta was working on a strategy, more so with the Legislative Assembly, the elected officials. And I had the opportunity to give a presentation to them in February about an agriculture or food processing strategy, the idea of basically having a regional network of incubators where people can take products to be developed. Maybe they have an idea for an innovation. They just don't have a factory themselves. And so a kind of fee-for-service program where you're renting a facility, someone builds, or built out this product for you, and then you can export it. And that initial capital could be invested into your own future facility, your own future factory. Unfortunately, there hasn't been too much movement on it here in Alberta. The document that was released a couple of days ago was fairly unambitious. So I'm hoping someone in the near future takes another crack at it here in Alberta, since we're not really going anywhere fast right now economically. The GDP growth is fairly low. So I'm hoping that we can do something much more ambitious when it comes to agriculture and food processing in the near future.
Sure. So for people that are kind of maybe in the space, is there anything that they can do to kind of potentially move this along, or not really? Or is it kind of like call your local government? Like, how does that kind of work?
In a lot of ways, I think it is call your local government, calling your local MLA, a member of Legislative Assembly, and raising concerns about whether or not we're doing enough in the food processing space, and even raising comparisons to other provinces. I know, for example, Saskatchewan, just to the east of Alberta, there's POS Biosciences. It was basically an organization that was government-controlled and invented canola oil, actually. The idea of, well, if you crush canola and can produce this cooking oil, that could be a value-added product that could be more profitable than just shipping canola overseas. And so it basically continues to be a center of excellence on anything having to do with oils, fish oil supplements, canola oil, as I mentioned previously, just anything having to do with oils. That's what they do.
Okay.
And so perhaps something we could do similarly in Alberta is finding one thing that we do really well and then saying, well, come invest in Alberta. Here's this particular product or genre of products that we specialize in, and this is the facility where you can help develop that. And basically, you have people coming from far and wide to invest in that. POS Biosciences in Saskatoon, I've had Japanese companies who are interested in developing fish oil supplements at that facility, and you wouldn't think, well, come from Japan, a big manufacturing hub in the Asia Pacific region, and do it in Saskatoon. But
sure.
There you go.
No, fair enough. But, and I don't know, like, what is the dollar comparison? Is their money worth more than the Canadian dollar right now?
The Japanese yen?
Yeah, is the yen worth more than the Canadian, or what's the conversion, I guess? Like, is
the conversion's pretty low on the Japanese yen side. I think I'd have to check, but it's certainly about maybe 11, 12 Japanese yen to a Canadian dollar.
Okay. I guess like the point is, like, if like the American dollar to the Canadian dollar, it's basically like 25%, maybe even a bit higher than that, depending on how the dollar is, at least right now. And it's been like that for a few years. It used to be almost like 50 cents on the dollar, right? So, just for Americans looking to maybe invest in something Canadian, like, sometimes it's 25% or more of a deal, right? Just your money just goes that much further, right? So I was just kind of curious if, the Japanese yen goes further, coming into Canada than, maybe investing somewhere else or even in their own country.
Very true. Yes. Yeah. And I know that Alberta has actually been sending trade missions down to Silicon Valley recently to see if they can get firms to relocate their headquarters to Calgary or to Edmonton from locations down there, just in part because of the currency issue. But then on the American side, they raise regulatory issues and taxation and so on, saying, well, it might actually be cheaper for you to stay put here in Silicon Valley. So I can't really say one way or the other on that side, but the currency might not necessarily play into it with a Japanese company relocating operations to Canada, but there's certainly other advantages being close to the product that you want to develop, and also closer to the market, the American market, if that's what you're gearing for.
No, that's fair. So I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on, you've kind of been and worked and done business kind of in a bunch of countries globally. Do you know a bunch of languages, or how have you kind of gotten through the language barriers? Because there's got to be some, and you've probably experienced it a bunch of times. And how do you kind of get over those? Translator,
Very true,
maybe?
yeah. Oh, well, I speak some European languages, of
Okay.
course, English, German, Russian, and so on. But
Oh, wow.
my Japanese is very weak. But I find actually that it is best to operate in English, just because when it comes to briefing or training up Japanese officials who are posted here, if they know that I speak Japanese quite well, I understand trying to develop a background on some of these really technical issues like oil and gas technologies, extraction methods, and so on. It becomes stressful, and then you want to revert back to your mother tongue, to
Right.
Japanese. But when you're going to be meeting with stakeholders or ministers on the Canadian side, they're going to be wanting to speak English. So
Sure.
my thing is to stubbornly insist on English and not develop my Japanese too much in order to make sure that the people that I work under have the right terminology and the right background in English to be able to competently discuss these issues with
Sure.
their Canadian counterparts. So it's worked so far for me. You'd figure that's counterintuitive to not learn more Japanese, but it's actually worked best sticking to English. My one concern is that I'm starting to lose my other languages just due to lack of practice.
Sure. No, that's actually interesting. And the other thing, I guess, that follow up question to that is, does some of the the oil field terms or some of those things even translate to some of those other languages? Because probably parts of the world don't. That's not a thing like for them, right? Like if they're not a oil drilling company, they might not even have a translation. Is that even a thing, or am I just kind of guessing here?
No, it's possible. Like sometimes it's a case of, like the universal word computer, where you'll have someone speaking another language, and then they are throwing in acronyms for the technical terminology. For example, steam-assisted gravity drainage, and instead you hear people saying SAGD,
Okay.
and so it's and definitely something that happens where other languages just don't have an equivalent, and if you did try to translate it, it could be a very, very long phrase. So
Sure.
the acronyms become very attractive to those speaking other languages.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, do you find though a lot of these people when you're dealing with politicians, they're like, I know, like I think Japanese, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of them take English in school, so their English is pretty good.
There is a fair amount of English language curriculum, but I think there's a strong cultural desire not to
Okay,
make mistakes. And
got
so
you.
I've experienced it somewhat as well in university, where you make a mistake, just the slightest grammatical error, and your teacher's stopping you to correct you. And so suddenly you don't sound so organic or natural when you're speaking that language because the grammar is perfect and so on. So I've had people in Germany or Austria saying, well, this is strange. You speak grammar school German, but you don't get any of the cultural references or any of the
Okay,
slang. And so
sure.
the fact that you're not allowed to make any mistakes sometimes is an issue. I don't think we as native speakers of English really realize how much slang and innuendo is involved in what we say. So a lot of Japanese speakers are very intimidated when they come to Canada or to the US and are realizing, my goodness, there's what I've learned is just the tip of the iceberg for this language.
Yeah, fair. And like even just the pop culture reference stuff that we talk about, even from like our childhood, or that you just kind of work into conversation. And if you're not born here, you didn't really grow up, here. I don't know, just
Very
like
true. Yeah,
watching, stuff in the 90s or the 2000s, you just would
that's
have no
true.
idea what we're talking about.
Well, I've even had someone yesterday actually stop me and say, "What does the phrase 'devil is in the details' mean?" And
Oh,
so
interesting.
I'm saying, "Oh well, okay, I'll explain," because I guess directly translated, it sounds a bit sinister. The devil himself is in the details. This is, should I look at this paper for very long, or will something jump out at me?
Sure.
So having to explain that it's not to be taken literally is something that I have to do from time to time.
Interesting. No, that's totally fascinating. But Paul, sadly, we're coming to kind of the end of the show, so maybe
Oh
let's
no.
let's close with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself, and maybe if you want to promote anything that you kind of the Japanese consulate or being a diplomatic aide.
Sure, yeah. I would say for anyone who's unsure about what to pursue as a career, someone who might be in university or in high school in the same position that I was in the past, definitely don't write off diplomacy. Don't think that it's something for just the educated elite, just a few people. Anyone, just even a small town guy from Brooks can wind up working for the Japanese in Western Canada. So I definitely encourage folks to look into that potential career. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, I can be reached easily on Twitter at Paul Pryce, PaulPryce, or you can find me on LinkedIn. And sometimes I write for the Canada West Foundation, which can be found at cwf.ca.
Perfect, Paul. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening. The music for the show was done by Electric Mantra. You can check them out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.